So as you can see, my topic today is the right to strike. And strikes have been on people's minds lately, although there has been this great decrease in strike activity. There's been the Day Without Immigrants. There's been the women's strike. There was the taxi driver strike in New York during the protests against Trump's immigration ban. We're near May 1st. In a few days, May 1st, which is International Labor Day, and hundreds of thousands of workers have said that they're going to go on strike that day. Hopefully that's true. And we've seen wider protests here and abroad that have taken the form of various kinds of strike activity, which has all raised the question, why do workers have the right to strike? And there are different accounts. For instance, some say that workers have a right to strike because they enjoy a kind of freedom of association in the economy, and that's the way to understand their right to strike. Others say that workers have a right to strike because it's necessary to make their bargaining power roughly equal with their employers, and that's what allows us to think of the labor contract as fair. And then others, like me, think that the right to strike is better understood as a right to resist oppression. Now, what I really want to argue today is two things, or that argument really has two parts. The first is just to get across and communicate why it matters how we justify the right to strike. There are these different accounts available, and it really matters how we justify the right to strike. And I'll spend about the first half of the talk kind of giving an account of why it matters how we justify the right to strike. And then in the second half of the talk, I will explain why I think the right to strike is best understood as a right to resist oppression. So here's a kind of dilemma that I think illustrates why it matters how we justify the right to strike. In one sector of the labor market, we have relatively high-skilled or specialized workers who are pretty hard to replace. So doctors, or sports players, or professors. Specialized. I didn't say high-skilled, I just said specialized. They're hard to replace. Or the 40,000 Verizon workers who went on strike last year, the ones who installed and serviced the fiber optic cables. They turned out to be pretty hard to replace. Now, for workers like this to go on strike, all they have to do is refuse to work. It requires a bit of organization, discipline, solidarity. But if they want to go on a strike and have some reasonable chance of success, then they can simply stop working. And because they're hard to replace, they have a pretty good chance of significantly slowing down or stopping production and winning some of their demands. Now, these are workers who tend to be pretty well compensated, enjoy pretty good benefits, have pretty good or relatively better job security. Now compare them with the majority of workers in other sectors of the labor market. So service, agriculture, basic industry, transportation. So I'm talking like Walmart workers, or Amazon warehouse workers, or poultry processors, or restaurant workers. These tend to be workers who enjoy relatively low wages, longer hours, work in worse conditions, enjoy less job security, and they tend to be much easier to replace. They're relatively lower skill. That's usually why they're relatively easy to replace. Now, for workers like this to go on strike and have some reasonable chance of success, it's not enough for them simply to refuse to work. They have to also, in some way, either prevent their bosses from hiring replacements, or prevent replacements from taking those jobs and crossing a picket line, or in some other way prevent work from happening. To do that, they have to resort to much more coercive strike tactics. I'm talking about things like sit-downs, which are occupations of a workplace, or mass pickets, which involve surrounding a workplace with a kind of wall of workers so that no managers or employers or suppliers can get in or out, or even sometimes sabotage, disabling or destroying some piece of machinery or the relevant object so that work can't take place. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like, I've got some pretty slides. So here are sit-downs. I should say I'm taking most of my examples from the American labor experience, but it's not because the United States is some kind of an exception in this case. The argument I'm developing applies to all liberal capitalist societies in particular. I just know the American case the best. In some ways, it's a little bit more extreme, but it's not exceptional. So sit-downs, the heyday of sit-down strikes in the United States was the 1930s. These were Woolworth waitresses who were sitting down in the kind of cafes in Woolworths where they worked, and they kind of occupied Woolworths demanding, I think it was union recognition, better wages, and better hours. These are the same counters that 30 years later would become quite famous when they were the subject of the sit-ins during the civil rights movement in the South. We have women's cigar rollers occupying a factory, I think this is Chicago, occupying a cigar rolling factory, demanding better pay, recognition, and also not having to breathe in such toxic fumes from all of the tobacco in the warehouse. And they had been inspired by the very successful Flint sit-down strike, which was a strike against auto manufacturing company in Flint, Michigan. And this is a somewhat misleading picture because it gives the impression that sit-down strikes are these very peaceful, leisurely affairs. But you get a feel for how it works. You occupy the factory. Now, by the end of the 1930s, this tactic was declared illegal. Workers had a right to strike, but this tactic was declared illegal, outside the bounds of the right to strike. And so the tactic somewhat faded from view, but occasionally it reappears. So during the financial crisis of 2008, the Chicago-based company Republic Windows and Steel was the subject of a strike. There had been a financial scandal and it was going to close, and I think the mostly Latino workforce occupied the building until they forced the company basically to sell it to an employer that would continue to employ them. And so it was a successful incident of a sit-down strike. So that's what sit-downs look like. You also have mass pickets. These are actually Japanese miners from, I think, 1960. I like this one just because it's a really intense mass picket. I mean, that's layers upon layers of working. It's completely obstructing any access to the work site. But in the United States, the heyday of mass pickets was also the 1930s and 1940s. So this is a mass picket during the longshoremen's strike, which was a West Coast strike that extended from Los Angeles through San Francisco, Portland, and this is Seattle. We have, and mass pickets were also declared illegal in the United States by the 1940, but they still did reappear on occasion. So this is the famous sanitation worker strike in Memphis, Tennessee, which is the strike that Martin Luther King was supporting when he was assassinated. And this is a moment where they engaged in a mass picket that kind of shut down commerce in the streets. And during the Verizon strike last year, there was a mass picket for a day in New York that shut down some commerce during the city. It was a one-day mass picket. Now, part of the reason I'm showing you these images, besides I think they're kind of objectively interesting, and they give you a feel for what it's like to actually engage in these sort of mass strike tactics, is to illustrate the dilemma. And the dilemma is this. These kinds of strike tactics, sit-downs, mass pickets, sabotage, are on the one hand necessary for these easily replaced workers to use if they're going to engage in a strike that has some reasonable chance of success. But they're extremely coercive. And they're not just generally coercive. They involve violating some of the basic economic and civil liberties that every liberal capitalist society protects. It violates the property rights of owners. And it violates, by extension, the managerial authority of those owners' managers. It also violates the freedom of contract and freedom of association of replacement workers, who normally are considered to be free to take jobs that are offered to them and can't just be blocked from accepting those jobs. And in general, they also tend to kind of disrupt the general public sense of law and order, because that's usually equated with the free flow of commerce. Right? And so the problem is this. In a liberal capitalist society, usually, the kind of basic principle of political morality is that we extend basic economic, civil, and political liberties to everyone on condition that nobody interferes with anyone else in their exercise of those same basic economic liberties. But if that's the principle, then it's unclear on what basis you could justify the use of these highly coercive tactics by strikers. And so there's a question. What has priority? These basic economic and civil liberties that every liberal capitalist society endorses, or the right to strike? And I bring this up just to, so this is the dilemma. And I bring it up because it shows why we really have to decide what we think the justification of the right to strike is. Because depending on how we justify it, we'll either think that the right to strike has priority, or we'll think that these basic economic and civil liberties have priority. But let me turn the heat up a little bit more and show you that the stakes are even higher. You might end up with blackouts. Okay, no. The stakes are even higher, because if you decide that the basic economic and civil liberties have priority, then you also think the state is authorized, or it is acting rightly, when it goes and represses the use of these coercive strike tactics by strikers. Right? If a mass picket or sit down is an unjust, illegitimate violation of property rights or contract rights, then it is right for the state to use its coercive legal authority to go and break up strikes. And by far and away, most of the violence that is associated with strikes has to do with these kinds of mass strike tactics and with the state going in and deciding to break them up. And here is just a quick, completely inadequate visual history of that experience of strike repression. And it begins in the 19th century. This 1886 is a major strike wave in the United States. Most of the images of strike repression from that period is in etchings and sketches because you didn't have on-the-scene photographers. And this is the police breaking up a mass picket in a kind of a march during striking streetcar workers. And I raise this in particular because this is the period in which police became militarized. The origins of the militarization of the police in the United States and elsewhere is when they acquire the role of strikebreakers. They get weapons, military training, uniforms, professional training. Here's the Lawrence textile strike. 1 hour north in Lawrence, Massachusetts. When the police were inadequate, you brought in the National Guard. And Harvard students got time off to go serve as strikebreakers during that strike. Not accidentally, the president of Harvard was one Lowell from a famous textile family. Sometimes the National Guard brought machine guns. And this is a strike in Colorado, which later ended in massive violence against the Ludlow strikers. About 20 of them died when the camp was attacked by the National Guard and set aflame. And this is San Francisco during that dock workers strike. It is interesting how frequently in the archives one finds photographs of tanks occupying cities during strikes. Probably the most frequent use of tanks until the American involvement in World War II. That'd be my guess. I'm not sure anyone's documented it. This is a street battle during the general strike in Minneapolis, and you see kind of a picket line set up there with the use of stalled automobiles. And this is fighting with the police during the battle of, I think it was the Battle of the Overpass. There were also private security forces. So every major business had its own private sort of army. A congressional inquiry in '39 found that GM had a private security force of 1,200 armed contract servicemen. And this is the Ford so-called service department. That's how they called these guys. But their only job was to beat up labor organizers and strike organizers. And this is police who shot on unarmed mass picket during a steel strike in '37. This is the Memphis strike. So during the Memphis strike, they brought in armored personnel carriers, I think it's the National Guard, to restore and maintain public order. That's the police beating up some of the strikers. This is a strike in Charleston, South Carolina. This is just a random, I could have picked any old, I mean, there's a million photographs like this. There's nothing special about this strike. It's just another strike with mass pickets and the police breaking it up. This is janitors striking in LA in 1990. And this is Harvard Square in 2013. There was it's not a mass strike, it's just a small strike by about, how many was it, Joe? 8, 10 employees. It was a small picket, 20. This is the police suppressing this very small little strike violently, and the police are being sued. I think that's the person who's suing them for brutality during the suppression of this particular strike. So the reason I've put these images on display is they remind us of sort of the stakes of deciding why we think workers have the right to strike, right? And how we come down on this. Because if we end up deciding that workers are not justified in using these sort of more coercive strike tactics like mass pickets and sit-downs, then whenever they get it in their mind, or even when they use slightly less coercive tactics, then we end up saying that the state has the authority to coercively enforce the laws, which means breaking up these strikes and use a great deal of violence. But if you end up thinking that the right to strike has a degree of priority, then we not only think, or we might end up deciding, not only that these uses of force are severely unjust and oppressive, but that workers sometimes have a right to resist this use of coercive authority. And things like the Battle of the Overpass were reasonable responses by workers in the face of this oppressive use of force. So that's hopefully a convincing version of my first point, which is that it matters why we think workers have the right to strike. So why do I say that the best account is the right to strike as a right to resist oppression? Well, to give a persuasive account of that, I think I have to convince you of two things. First, that there really is systematic oppression in the economy, and then that the right to strike as a right to resist oppression is the best way of responding to those facts. So what do I mean by oppression? Well, by oppression, I just mean the systematic and organized unfair limitation of people's freedom. Okay? So systematic, not accidental or occasional, but systematic and organized unfair limitation on people's freedom. So why do I say the economy is oppressive? Let me give you some examples and then step back and say what I think these are examples of. And again, my examples are from the American case because I know it best, but I've been educated by my research assistants on the way in which this is true of other economies as well. So let's take the example of Walmart employees. Walmart's, I think, the largest private employer in something like 16 states. So Walmart employees, when they're working the night shift, restocking shelves and cleaning the premises, can be locked in the store overnight. And if they need to get out, they have to call their managers, hopefully wake someone up, have them come, unlock the door, and only then can they leave, right? Regardless of whatever the emergency is, they can be locked indoors. Amazon warehouse employees, the people who are like packaging the stuff that shows up on your door. In the summer months, they are made to work in warehouses that are so hot that Amazon has been known to park emergency vehicles outside the warehouse to rush anyone who succumbs to heat exhaustion to the ER. And Amazon keeps it hot because it reduces their air conditioning costs. Moreover, it turns out that it's a legal power for Amazon to keep its employees in security lines for up to an hour after the workers are off the clock, so they've punched out, they're not getting paid, to check to see if they've been stealing anything from the warehouse. And this is a job requirement, so they're required to do it as part of their job, but they're not paid for it because they're not said to be doing any work. A recent report, I think it was by Oxfam, found that poultry workers in poultry processing, major poultry processing plants in the United States, were coming to work wearing diapers. And the reason that they were wearing diapers was because they didn't have enough time during their personal breaks to take care of all of their personal business. And if they asked for any further break, like a bathroom break, the managers regularly denied the request, regardless of whether they were sick or pregnant, in some cases were pregnant women, or just any human being who needs to use the bathroom because they didn't happen to go to the bathroom during the personal break, right? And if you think this is only a feature of, say, poultry processing, one of the grievances of some of the workers during the Verizon strike was that if they were up on a pole or on a roof installing some fiber optic cable, and it was summer and they were hot and they needed to use the bathroom or get a glass of water, they were first being required to call their manager, get approval from their manager to go to the bathroom. And if they didn't get that approval, then they went to the bathroom anyway or got the drink anyway, they would end up in disciplinary proceedings, dock of pay, or limitation of hours, and if they did this more than once, they could be fired. Now, the point about all of these, oh, sorry, I forgot one that I think is particularly important. For many of these workers, especially Walmart workers, people in restaurant work or retail, they have no idea week to week what exactly their hours are going to be. They might work the same hours, they might work fewer, they might be more hours, but different hours than the week before. Right? And so it's extremely difficult for any of them to organize their lives on any rational, predictable basis. For those of you with children, imagine, right? Without children, imagine. I mean, you don't have to have children, but I was home yesterday with my kid. That's why that one's on my mind. Imagine that you have no idea what you're going to do week to week. Now, the important feature of all these examples is that they are all examples of legal powers that managers have exercised over their employees. None of these were examples of something that was illegal. They are all forms of legal authority that managers exercise in the workplace over their employees. And in fact, it's a general fact of the typical workplace in any liberal capitalist society that managers enjoy a wide swath of uncontrolled authority over their employees, to control hours and scheduling, to control the introduction of new technologies or the definition of tasks, to determine who gets what kinds of breaks, to determine various hiring and firing practices, and other aspects of working conditions. And I think if once we become aware of that fact, it's fair to say that the workplace is best understood as a site of government. The workplace isn't just a kind of place of free exchange or private relationships. It is a site of government. But it's not just any old site of government. It's an extremely hierarchical, somewhat despotic form of government, because it's one in which those who are subject to commands by the people who govern them have very little formal legal control over those commands. And to kind of put a point on it, in other essential social institutions, we don't accept this kind of authority. So we don't, for instance, the family is no longer organized legally as a patriarchy. One person isn't just formally subject to the will of one of the other adults who are party to that relationship. The state is also not a monarchy or an enlightened despotism. We think that the only legitimate form of state is one in which those who are subject to its authority have roughly equal control over its commands and directives, right? But the workplace, I think, is fairly said to be highly oppressive because it's a site of arbitrary authority over which workers have very limited formal and legal control. It's deeply hierarchical, and it involves authority over many of the intimate details of the way in which people use their time on a daily basis. So that's one aspect of the oppression of the economy. But it's unfortunately even worse than that. Because why do people end up in these kinds of workplaces, in these types of authoritarian relationships in the workplace? Well, this is where we have to appreciate the broader structural sources of oppression. The reason that people end up in workplaces like this is because of the deeply unequal, legally protected control over property and wealth. Right? There are some people in the economy who have no reasonable alternative but to find a job and earn money. They have no reasonable alternative because they have no other way of meeting their basic needs. Right? The only way in which they can get a reliable source of income is by getting a job. So those people are forced to work. Right? While there's another group of people who, in virtue of the wealth that they have accumulated or inherited, are not forced to work. They might, but they're not forced to work. And so the basic structure of the economy is one in which you have a deeply unequal system of forcing some to work while others are not forced to work. But it's not just that some are forced to work while others aren't, but those who are forced to work have to work for those who control employment and investment. So some work for others. And in the typical case, this means that those who are forced to work are forced to enter these workplaces that are typically characterized by these deeply hierarchical relations of authority, which then ends up meaning, because of the broader structure of dependence of those who work on those who employ, which is meaning that employers and their managers even enjoy certain kinds of material power that go beyond the legal power they enjoy. So just to give you one headline example, I was reading the other day a recent study which showed that American workers are subject to between $8 and $14 billion worth of wage theft a year. And they just have to take it. And this wage theft is concentrated almost entirely in the service sector and in agriculture. And in the kind of worst jobs where workers tend to have the worst economic opportunities. Right? So this is an example of another layer of the oppression insofar as managers can often get away with a lot of things when it comes to workers who have the least amount of power in the economy, over and above the legally protected authority that they have. So this is why I think it makes sense to say that the economy isn't just somewhere where wealth is produced, where people's standards of living are determined, but is in fact best understood as a structure of power and authority that places enormous restraints on some people's freedom and much less restraint on other people's freedom, and that this is deeply unjustified and is therefore oppressive. All right? So that's step one of the argument for seeing the right to strike as a right to resist oppression. The second step then, with these facts in mind, we can stop showing pretty pictures, because this is the part that isn't like fun about the argument, I guess. But I sort of thought, how do I show pictures about this? But I've already done it. So the second step is, then what do we do with these facts about the economy, and how does this help us evaluate the different accounts of the right to strike? Well, one account of the right to strike is that, which we can call liberal. The labels don't matter, it's just to fix ideas, but which is the liberal view, which is that workers have a right to strike because they already enjoy freedom of association. And the right to strike is just the way in which you exercise your freedom of association in the economy. Now, there are two really simple problems with this account. First, it doesn't connect the right to strike to any economic injustice. It doesn't say workers have a right to strike because there's something unjust about the economy. In fact, it assumes that there's something fair about the economy. We protect this civil liberty, and here's one way in which it can be exercised. But what this further means then is that the right to strike has to be limited by the normal limitations that apply to the economic and civil liberties. So workers who exercise the right to strike in this sense can associate together, they can try and go on strike, but they have to respect everybody else's basic economic and civil liberties, because that just goes hand in hand with thinking that this is an exercise of freedom of association. So on this account, workers have a right to strike, but it's one that could only be meaningfully exercised by the hardest to replace workers, since those are really the only ones who could possibly carry off a strike in such a peaceful and non-coercive manner. Another version then of the right to, so this seems to me a deeply inadequate way of thinking about the right to strike. Another version, which you'd call social democratic, but again, doesn't matter the label, is to say, well, no, the right to strike does address an injustice, which is that workers sometimes have somewhat unequal bargaining power in the economy. And it's only when we protect labor rights, including a right to strike, that we can say that the contracts that workers strike with their employers are truly free, or really fair. So in this sense, it's a way of really realizing one of the civil liberties that are nominally protected in a standard liberal capitalist constitution. This is reasonable. This seems to be a reasonable account. It certainly gets at some truth. There is an important economic injustice that it identifies. But the problem with the account is that it's far too narrow. It represents the problem of power as just a question of the bargaining power that employees have with their employers at the moment of making the contract. It says nothing directly either about the background structure of oppression that involves forcing some people to work and not others, the background control over property and investment and employment that is its own independent deep source of oppression. So there's nothing to say directly about that and just assumes that that structure remains in place, and has nothing directly to say about the relationships of domination in the workplace itself. Those are incidental questions. So it's far too narrow an understanding of the kind of injustice that we can see a right to strike to, and ends up narrowing the kinds of things that workers may legitimately strike over. Usually tends to be about sort of wages and benefits, rather than any of these other broader questions of power and authority in the economy. So what's distinct then about the right to resist, seeing the right to strike as a right to resist oppression? Well, I think the first point is to say that when we understand the right to strike as a right to resist oppression, we're saying that strikes can be about the full array of unjust limitations on workers' freedom, right? Strikes can be about things like particular policies that affect the distribution of control over property and investment. Or strikes can be about various grievances and exercises of managerial authority. So if we see it as a right to resist oppression, then it's a way of arguing for the right to strike in a way that's responsive to the entirety of the injustices that I'm saying exist in the economy. And I should just add that you might not agree with every aspect of my characterization of the economy. But so long as you agree that there are some deep and systematic injustices in the economy that can't just be resolved by altering the terms of a labor contract, then I think this particular view should still be persuasive to you. Because the point is that you don't assume that the only moment or site at which this oppression exists is at the moment when workers make contracts with their employers. It also extends past the time of contract and prior to the fact that they're forced into the labor market on equal terms in the first place. So that's the first point about why I think seeing it as a right to resist oppression is more responsive to the kinds of injustices that I think, and the concern for freedom that I think animates the best argument for the right to strike. Just emphasize, the point is to say that what really drives this argument is to say that what workers are demanding, or what workers should be free to demand, isn't just higher levels of income or better benefits, but a greater freedom, and therefore resistance to the wide array of forms of unfreedom that they face in the economy. The second advantage that I think this view has is that it means that the right to strike is shaped in a way that allows it to actually protect the interest that justifies it. I know that's sort of an obscure way of saying it. So by shape, I just mean that the shape of a right is what kinds of permissions and restrictions there are on its exercise. Now, we saw in the other two cases, the shape of the right, of their version of the right to strike, was limited by the need to respect the basic economic and civil liberties, because that way of thinking derived the right to strike from those basic economic and civil liberties. But this way of thinking, the right to strike as a right to resist oppression, just begins from the basic interest that workers have in exercising their freedom, exercising their collective capacity to reduce the oppression to which they are subject. Which means that the right must include permission to use some kinds of means that gives them a reasonable chance of actually resisting that oppression. It won't just import these restrictions that normally apply to basic civil liberties. So I think that's a further advantage. It's more suitably tailored to the aim it's supposed to promote, which is to give workers the actual capacity to use their own agency to resist the oppression they face. The third and I think final superiority of this particular way of thinking is that it also explains why the right to strike enjoys priority over these basic economic and civil liberties in the case of labor disputes, right? Which is the following. If the right to strike is a right to resist oppression, and the oppression that workers are resisting is a product of the way in which the law protects these basic economic and civil liberties, then those basic economic and civil liberties, at least when it comes to the economy, are not worthy of very much respect, because it's the protection of those particular liberties that creates the oppression in the first place. And in fact, whatever claim to respect those liberties have is actually a claim for the right to strike, because it's actually in the exercise of the right to strike that workers come closer to demanding the kind of equal freedom that is the basis for any reasonable account of just economic and social relationships. So this way of thinking about the right to strike answers the question in a way that's both coherent and establishes on limitations. It's just an argument about why the right to strike would have priority over basic economic and civil liberties like property rights, freedom of contract, freedom of association in the economy, and even general accounts of law and order. Because when the law protects those rights, it actually creates the very oppression that the right to strike is a response to. Since the normal justification of those basic economic and civil liberties is that they create a kind of fair or just system of social cooperation, but they in fact just create this highly unequal system of forcing, coercion, and domination. It's actually the right to strike that has a better claim to having priority. So we can see then how, if you think about the right to strike this way, we resolve the dilemma that I began with in a very different way. We say that as a feature of their right to strike, it is permissible, perhaps even good, that workers don't respect the property rights of employers and the authority of managers, and instead demand better terms by using some of these coercive tactics. Now let me just conclude with two, have I gone over it? No, okay. We just conclude with two thoughts. I'm sure at this point, some of you are thinking, well, it sounds like he's saying strikers can do just whatever they want. And that's not what I'm arguing. I'm arguing something narrower. I'm saying that this central dilemma about whether strikers have the permission to violate certain property rights and other basic economic and civil liberties in the context of labor disputes, whether that's permitted. Right? I'm saying that particular, the normal respect we accord to basic economic and civil liberties isn't required, because this is because what strikers are doing are actually demanding fairer terms of social cooperation. They're demanding more freedom than they currently enjoy. But that doesn't mean that they can just do anything they want. Right? Doesn't mean all moral rules and human behavior are suspended. It just means our normal respect for these basic liberties isn't as strong. Secondly, I imagine some of you are also wondering, or might be saying to yourselves, well, okay, it's true that the economy is deeply unjust, but why bother with the right to strike? Right? Why not just argue for something else, like a fairer economy? Yeah, okay, now I'm seeing all the nods. Okay. Well, the reason is because I think that's a complete non sequitur. So the question is, what may those who suffer oppression do to resist the oppression they face? the answer is not, well, we should have a non-oppressive economy. Because that's telling people, in light of an ideal that is incredibly infeasible and unbelievably remote, they shouldn't try and resist the oppression where they are. It's a kind of apology for quietism. Right? There are good reasons for wanting to know what an ideal or much more just or more or less just economy is. But to say, in response to my argument, oh, well, no, we shouldn't argue for right to strike. Surely what we should argue for, sort of in the abstract, is a just economy, is, I think, in the context of the argument, just to say, well, when you ask the question, what may actually existing workers do to resist the oppression that they faced, your answer is nothing. Or argue for an incredibly remote political ideal that has little to no chance of being realized any time in the short or future or medium term within the currently existing institutions. So I'm not saying it isn't worth contemplating these questions about better social policies and so on, but it's a separate question and not a response to this, to what I think is the more immediate social and political question, which is, when people face a kind of systematic limitation on their freedom, what may they do to resist it? I think the right to strike is one very important way in which workers in the economy can resist that oppression. So, thank you very much.